Hello, Streakers. Hopefully, you all are doing fantastic. Welcome to another episode of Streaking. Today, Jamie and I have a special guest who is a UCLA-trained neuroscientist and author of the best-selling book, The Upward Spiral. His research focuses on the neural basis of depression and anxiety and how simple behaviors like exercise, sleep, and gratitude can have profound effects on mental health. He's been featured in numerous media outlets, including Time Magazine, The Atlantic, and NPR. His book has been translated into multiple languages and has received widespread critical acclaim, including being named one of the best psychology books of 2015 by the Greater Good Science Center. He has a wealth of experience in yoga and mindfulness, physical fitness, and even stand-up comedy. We're thrilled to have this accomplished expert with us today to share his knowledge and experience. Let's welcome to the Streaking Podcast, Dr. Alex Korb, and let's start streaking. What is streaking and why should you do it?
Streaking is how you set up personal winning streaks. Look at who you want to be and what you need to do to become that person. This is Streaking.
I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jami.
And we are streakers. Through 30 years of marriage and 7 children, we have learned the power of consecutive consistency or streaking.
To start streaking is simple. You just follow these 3 laws. Make it laughably simple, keep a record, and join the streaking community.
Streaking is your hidden superpower. With it, you will consistently progress and grow in whatever area of life you want.
In this podcast, Jeff and I will share all the fun, exciting, serious, solemn, wonderful parts of family, spiritual, professional, and personal life, and how streaking powers it all.
So join us in the conversation, join the movement, and start streaking today.
Dr. Korb, we're so excited to have you on today. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. It was a wonderful introduction.
And I'm dying to ask about stand-up comedy, but I'm going to start by asking, as I read your book and as I've been preparing for this podcast, I've just been really excited to ask you how you got started studying neuroscience. Like, what took you to studying the brain?
Well, I think I've always been interested in science and like how things work. And I've also been interested in our emotions and motivations. And I just sort of noticed like, oh, sometimes it feels really easy to be focused and productive and confident. And other times you just feel stuck and everything is going wrong. And not only is it different at different times, but it also seems to be different for different people.
Right.
And trying to understand this balance between like, oh, our intellect and planning and our emotions, like it's been, and how that relates to our, what we actually do has always been fascinating to me. And then in college, I took a neuroscience class because it sounded cool. And I was like, oh, like this explains all of that. And the more I learned, the more fascinated I became, because like I realized like most smart, goal-oriented, successful people aren't used to just like doing things just because someone's like, hey, you should do it this way. Like, we're like, but why? Like, I want to, like, why does that work? How is that actually helping? Like, I just don't want to just, take it on faith. Although sometimes that gets in the way because sometimes there's good advice that you should just do, even though you don't really understand why. But for a while, I finally learned like, oh, sometimes I was getting in my own way because I wasn't doing the things that I know I should be doing because I didn't understand why they should work or how they worked. And so that's one of the reasons why I started studying what I did and started writing The Upward Spiral, because it was my interest in like understanding these things for myself. Like, oh, does gratitude, does that really work? Does, exercise, does that really work? Like, why does it work? And for a lot of these things that have been around for a long time that people tell you all the time, like, oh yeah, you should just be more grateful. You should just take some breaths or whatever. Like, it's so easy to dismiss because they sound, so simple. But I know that once I learned the neuroscience behind them, that these things have actual effects on their brain, that just made me able to get out of my own way. And I was like, oh, I guess I should do these things because they're actually affecting my brain. I wanted to share that with other people. But I kind of joke a lot of times, like anyone with a degree in mental health or something related is really just trying to figure out what's wrong with themselves. And
that's why we wrote Streakin.
That's why we wrote Streakin.
That's our whole joke. We're like, we need help.
Yeah.
And so like that, but like for me, it was like the neuroscience perspective that was most helpful, because it was like, oh yeah, I get that these things are good, but why? Like, how are they actually affecting the brain? But even before that, like, why am I stuck in the first place? And not even like in things as extreme as depression, but like, why sometimes does it feel really easy to just like meet people and talk and be confident, and other times you're like self-conscious and stuck and stressed out, which just that was actually, I think, the first instance of like of being caught in a downward spiral that I recognized in my life, when I like had a crush on this girl in like 8th grade, I think. And I recognized like, oh, like I want to be like calm and confident, because then it'll be more likely that she'll like me. But like, what if she doesn't like me? Then I would feel so disappointed, and that is stressful, which makes it harder to be calm and confident. So it's less likely that she'll actually like me, because I'm going to be this awkward, stressed out guy. And I was like, but that sucks. Because I do want her to like me, and that stresses me out, which makes it less likely that the thing that I want. And that's when I realized like, oh, like sometimes things are just sort of these like self-reinforcing downward spirals.
Right.
And it was only until much later on when I realized like, oh, that's because that's the dynamics of the brain. Like that's how the brain works. Ways to turn it around.
I loved, that was, as I was reading the book, I loved how often you would say things that I'm like, yeah, I've heard that before. But then being able to know that it's backed by science, and then also recognizing that something simple is like, oh, smiling at someone. Or when you talked about, there was one part where you talked about fake laughing, and I thought about you, because he sometimes,
because I fake laugh.
He'll fake laugh with our kids sometimes, and it drives him crazy, but then he'll just keep going and going, and pretty soon the whole family is laughing. But I thought about that, and I was like, even a fake laugh is actually changing your brain. Like it just changes the way that you think about the things that we do. And so for me, totally, it gave more credibility and purpose to the little things that I do, and then the ability to change those little things, because I'm like, oh, I'm doing this on purpose now. I'm doing this intentionally.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's funny. It's like one of the most common criticisms that I read about the book, because I read like all of the reviews and the negative reviews.
Do you really?
Yeah.
You read them all?
My wife is like, don't read the negative.
Don't read the negative ones.
And my view, it's like if you can't read your negative reviews or face like the criticisms that people say about you, then you're not really clear about like what's important to you or what your limitations are. Because when someone has a criticism, well, either it's valid and you should listen to them and be like, oh yeah, that's a good point.
Good point.
Like next time I write a book, like I should take that into account. Or it's not relevant to what you're trying to accomplish, in which case you can be like, oh, I feel bad that you had one expectation and I was doing something else. So I don't need to take it personally. And one of the most common criticisms that people have is like, well, this is nothing new. Like everyone knows that you're supposed to exercise and sleep well and practice gratitude and whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not like coming up with all these things. Like these things have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that people have known like these things are good for you.
Right.
But do you do them?
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
if not, one of the reasons that people don't do them is because they they don't understand why they work, or they recognize like, no, my problem is like I'm overthinking things, or like I have depression or anxiety, like this is an issue in my brain. Like, stop telling me to like just do this spiritual practice of like slow breathing and
Right.
mindfulness or whatever, like focus on the positive, like this woo woo stuff. And I'm like, hey, like all of this stuff that's been around that we've known for a long time, like that stuff actually changes the activity and chemistry of key brain circuits. Like, here's what's happening in your brain. This is why you're stuck in this pattern in the first place. And like all these little things that sound so silly have actual measurable effects on our brain activity and chemistry. And oftentimes, the way that these silly little things, like going for a walk or getting some sunlight or taking a slow breath, these things can actually target the brain in ways that are even more nuanced and sometimes even more powerful than these like generally accepted like high-tech scientific things, like, you know, brain stimulation techniques, or you know, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So like, I think we've all understood, like, yeah, obviously medicine and research has done a lot, and like it can do stuff with our brains, and that's great. And that's really important for some people in some situations, but it's not the only way to modulate the activity and chemistry. And so, yeah, for like, if you're depressed, some people, the best way to change their serotonin system is taking a medication, you know, taking a pill, and boom, just one pill a day. And after a few months, like, you're totally great and wonderful if that's you. But unfortunately, that's only like, you know, 30 or 40% of people. And the rest of people, well, there's a better way to modulate your brain activity. And for most people, it's not going to be one thing. It's going to be some combination. And so it's not about like, what's the one, let's find the one thing that's going to fix everything for everyone all the time. Like, hey, this is how the brain works, and it's complicated. And like, here's the whole menu of options that you have whenever you're stuck, that you can do on your own to reduce stress, improve focus, increase motivation, increase happiness, and all that wonderful stuff.
All of those things.
So and the way that you have the book laid out, you go into a lot of the neuroscience, and you explain it in a way that I can understand maybe a little bit. I can't listen to you on 2x speed. I have to do it on 1x, maybe a little slower. But one of the things that you do is you explain a little bit of the neuroscience, and then you get into about exercise, gratitude, mindfulness, those type of things. Tell us a little bit about what happens in the brain when someone does express gratitude on a regular basis. You know, what are all the connections that start to happen, and why do they happen in that way?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens when we practice gratitude, but I just wanted to make a point about like why I start the book with like all the stuff that's going on in the brain. Because when I was first writing it, the editor was actually like, why are you spending so much time just talking about all this stuff about how the brain works? Like, just tell people what they can do. Right. You know, that's what people want to know. And I was like, oh, well, there are a million books that'll tell you like, do this, do this, do that. And like, you don't do it. Why? Because you don't understand why you're doing it. And once you understand like, oh, I have the power to change my brain, then it increases your sense of agency. So you can choose to do this. And Jami, I think you sort of pointed that out too, that like, oh, you still do the same things maybe, but now it's like, oh, more intentional. Right. Because it's not like, oh, I'm just doing this because someone told me, like, oh, I'm doing this because I can see the benefits and how it's going to actually affect me. So that like gratitude was one of those things for me. Like, people are always telling you, oh, focus on the positive or think about what you're grateful for. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll do it. And yes, sometimes like it's helpful. But for me, understanding the fact that, oh, this is actually changing how my brain is functioning and how these key circuits are communicating, that made me do it with greater intention and commitment, which also improves the effects in a lot of cases. So specifically with gratitude, I mean, there's many ways to practice gratitude, but one of the effects that it has is to activate the brainstem region that produces dopamine. So dopamine is this chemical that's involved in a lot of things like motivation and reward and habits, and the effects that it has kind of depends on where it's released. But we have this like one spot in the brainstem, like really deep down, that is creating and producing all this dopamine that's going to different parts of your brain. And practicing gratitude actually helps stimulate this region of the brain.
Wow.
There like one way of practicing gratitude that I like to think about is like just thinking about the things that have happened to you that you're grateful for, like a happy memory. And one study that asked people to think about happy memories showed that it actually increased production of serotonin, another key neurotransmitter system, and it increased serotonin production in a key part of the emotional circuitry of your brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, that is really crucial in attention and what we're paying attention to. And so there are also, there's so many effects. Like gratitude can improve the quality of your sleep, so that your sleep is more restful and restorative for your brain, which then helps you get more benefits out of the same amount of sleep. So you don't have to sleep more, it works better. And but one of the things that I like to emphasize and remind people, and Jeff, like your comment about not being able to listen to it fast reminded me of this as well. It's like sometimes it's really easy when I'm talking about, oh, like dopamine is, wait, which one's dopamine, which one's serotonin, and like, wait, the anterior cingulate cortex or with the anterior or the posterior, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and confused by all the different terms that kind of sound similar. But I include those to be precise and to communicate for the people who like want to understand this and confirm, like in the science literature, like what they're doing, but to actually apply it to your life, it's totally fine if you can't remember like which brain region is called what or which chemical does what. Like the most important level to understand it is at the sort of level like, oh, there's an attention circuit in your brain and a motivation circuit and a habit circuit. Oh, and sometimes like when you're paying attention to one thing, it changes the motivation circuit and what habits get triggered. And sure, you can try and remember like, oh, you're talking about the anterior cingulate and the, orbitofrontal cortex and the dorsal striatum, and like, but you don't need to remember all of those complex names in order to use the information. You just need to remember like, oh, that's the habit circuit in my brain, like pulling me into this bad habit, because it doesn't care about the long term. It just cares about the short term, and so on. And so I just want to reassure people that it's okay if you don't memorize all of these different.
We don't have to get it right on a test to
right, exactly. There's not a test. The test is just living your life.
I appreciated that you pushed back on your editor to include that information, because for me, as I read the book, it really was helpful to know those parts of the brain and what each part of the brain was doing and which ones acted automatically and what other ones needed some stimuli or some external stimuli in order to get activated so that things get activated. One of the things that we talk about a lot in Streaking and that we loved about how this coincided with your book is that we work with the repetitive side of habit. In other words, that's what Streaking is about, is getting the repetition down. And whether or not it becomes automatic depends on a whole bunch of things. But what we look at is, to your point, is even a laughably small thing like a push-up a day is going to make a difference.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that. Why does even something laughably small make a difference in the opportunity to change your downward spiral to an upward spiral?
Right. Well, part of it is because of this concept of neuroplasticity, which is the fact that your brain is malleable and can be reshaped. And whatever actions you take, you are strengthening or weakening particular circuits or synapses, connections in the brain. So if you're sitting on the couch, or like you wake up in the morning and you have a thought of like, oh, maybe I should do some exercise. And then the next thought you have is like, nah, that sounds difficult. I'm just gonna,
Have a bowl of
watch
Fruit
TV
Loops.
or something. Okay, well then you're strengthening that habit in the brain. Like you're living your life, like everything you're doing is contributing to something. So by just doing one push-up, well, you're strengthening the habit of, well, when I think maybe I should do some exercise, and then the thought pops in my head, oh, I should just watch Netflix. Then I'm like, okay, well, let me just do one push-up. Okay, so I'm strengthening that habit. And it turns out like the first push-up is the hardest push-up. Push-up.
Yes.
I mean, the 20th push-up or the 50th push-up is hard for a different reason. It's hard on your muscles, but like remembering to do something in the first place, or convincing yourself that it's worthwhile to do, that's the hardest thing. And a lot of times people get in their own way because they're like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to exercise. It's not understanding that you're supposed to exercise that makes exercise useful. It's actually doing it. And sometimes why people don't do exercise is because it's really challenging. And they're like, well, I have to, get my heart rate up to a certain level and I'm going to be pumping. It's like, oh, I don't have the energy to that. I'm not going to do anything. And it's important to realize like, well, the small amount of exercise that you actually do is infinitely more beneficial to you than some big, huge plan that you don't do. Because when you have some big, huge plan, you're like, oh yeah, that's really exciting. Oh, but I don't know if I can do that. Oh, that's too stressful. I'm just going to watch TV. Well, then you train the habit of ignoring your big, huge plans. And then because that habit gets trained, then every time you have these big, huge plans, it becomes harder and harder to enact them because your dorsal striatum, the habit circuit, is pulling you to watch TV. If instead, every time you're like, oh, let me just do one push-up before I watch TV. Okay, well then that is training that habit. And if that's all you did, that's still a heck of a lot better than just resigning yourself. I guess I'm not going to do some exercise. I'll just watch TV. Like you're creating this habit with a bit of intention. And the more that you do it, the easier it becomes. And the other benefit is that habits get strung together. So often like one habit triggers other habits. So the habit of doing the first push-up, really helpful for triggering the habit of doing the second push-up, because when I'm sitting on the couch, the idea of getting up off the couch and getting down onto the floor, like, oh, that doesn't seem very appealing. Or like going for a run, like I'd have to put on my shoes and like whatever, like, and then again, we have all these thoughts. Those thoughts get strengthen or the connection to certain actions or inactions in our brain, which makes it more likely that we'll get stuck in those same patterns in the future. Instead, if we're like, yeah, I know it's uncomfortable, I'm just going to get off the couch and do one push-up, like that is really, that's the biggest hurdle to overcome.
It is.
And now once you're on the ground, like in push-up position, the thought of like doing another push-up, it seems much
Not
more
so bad.
appealing. Right. You're like, well, I'm already here. Like, in fact, to get back up on the couch, I basically have to do a push-up anyway. It's kind of easier to just do another push-up and I might as well do some foot or whatever. And so like it's not just changing that habit, like, but that habit changes your environment and it changes what you're likely to do next. And it changes your brain, because by having the thought, like, I don't really want to do a push-up. No, I'm going to do it anyway. That basically sends the message to yourself, like, hey, I'm in control of this situation based on what I think is important. And that's sort of this like meta habit and belief that like, oh, makes everything easier, as opposed to, oh, I don't feel like doing a push-up. Well, I guess I can't do a push-up and I don't, but and then, oh, I'm not in charge. My feelings are just in charge, or what someone tells me to do is in charge. And then that creates more stress. And so by just these little changes, it can have so many effects, not just in training that habit, but in living our life with more intention and taking control over it, and also by triggering other helpful habits.
So one of the things that I have been in my brain really trying to get to is, why is our tendency toward not doing the exercise, not doing the gratitude, not doing, I've written about it several times, but I've never really been able to quantify or really look at it and say, it's almost like, what is it, Newton's law, where it's a body in rest wants to remain in rest. It's and that's like what we naturally go to. It's not like we're naturally like, hey, let's go, let's move around, let's do that.
Right. And the answer to that question for exercise is probably slightly different than for gratitude. We can talk more about these things, but like and that's where I think it's sometimes helpful for people to realize, like, your brain is complex. Like, there's not one reason for everything. People like, if you could distill everything down to like one motivation,
give me the one thing and I'll do it.
Your brain has different parts that want different things, because the world is complex. And that's why we evolved these complex brains. And we're not just like single-celled organisms, like moving towards the light and moving away from the light. But at least when it comes to exercise, there's this Harvard professor, and I'm blanking on his name. He wrote a book about this, but I heard him talking on the radio, and it was really a really helpful perspective, which is basically, we didn't evolve to exercise, like just expending energy for the sake of expending energy.
Yes.
The opposite of what was useful to survive, because, and this is where I think it's always helpful whenever we're trying to figure out like why we do something or feel a certain way that seems to make no sense. A lot of times it makes a lot more sense if you put yourself in the perspective of, an early human 100,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, when the human brain was first evolving. And a lot of those things make a lot more sense in that situation. And our societies have certainly gotten a lot more complex, and our technologies have gotten a lot more complex, and our social, organizations have gotten more complex, but our brains have basically stayed the same over the last 200,000 years. And so in the times when our brains were evolving, it was really hard to get enough food. So you wouldn't want to just burn calories for no reason. You want to be as lazy as possible and conserve, all your calories, unless you absolutely had to either not get eaten or find a mate.
Find food.
Right. Or find food. And because our brains evolved to survive and reproduce. And everything, all of your genes that were passed down to you, those were the genes that got passed down, the ones that made it humans more adaptive at surviving and reproducing. And so in 50,000 years ago on this, savannas of Africa, people just running around and jogging extra, those people probably died. And the people who survived were oh, I'm just gonna, munch on this and then just chill out for the rest of the day. And those people, they had enough calories to survive. So it's just that nowadays our environment is different, where we have tons of high calorie food that is easily available, that has been specifically designed by companies to be more stimulating of our dopamine systems than naturally occurring foods. And so, now if you're not conscientious about that and you just sort of follow your, natural instincts, well, then you, get diabetes and, you're overweight and but that's why it's helpful to realize how the brain works in the first place.
Yeah.
Because otherwise people view it as a moral failing. Oh, I just don't have enough willpower or whatever. And it's no, this is just how the human brain works. There's not something wrong with you. It's just, not the specific habits. Well, one, the way the brain isn't necessarily ideally suited for modern society. And then two, the specific habits that have been trained into your brain just might not be ideally adapted to your specific situation. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't even necessarily mean that there's something wrong with the situation, that society's broken. It's just there's a mismatch somewhere. And it might not be a mismatch for other people, but might be a mismatch for you. So that's the situation you're in. Okay, what are you gonna do about it? And understanding how the human brain works and also creates these patterns, these specific patterns that are unique to us, I think sometimes helps us have more acceptance of ourselves. That makes total sense. Oh, I see why I'm that way. Oh, that's part of that is how the human brain is. And part of that's just, that's how my, parents, that's where their habits and that, was something I've been doing for 20 years. It's now I see I want to change. My brain's not just going to actually let me change super easily, but because it's just trying to protect me in these ways. But having that acceptance of yourself, of not that you should always be this way or that it will always be this way, but acceptance of this is how it is right now. Frees you up to then say, okay, what am I going to do about it?
To make that difference.
That's really neat as far as I look at it. So survival is that's the natural instinct. I need to survive. I need to reproduce. I need to eat. I need to have those things. And therefore I want to conserve calories. And in our day, now what we need to do in order to reprogram is be intentional, like what you were saying, as far as I'm intentionally going to do at least one push-up. I'm intentionally going to walk outside. I'm intentionally going to be grateful. I think, Jami, you had something you wrote down as far as from the book about intentionally every night being thankful
just
for
being
something. Or what was
the
it?
gratitude. Just that you had talked about thinking of one happy memory each night before you go to bed and just writing in a journal to
Yeah.
help you be able to be grateful. And the one thing that was a little bit kind of like just a passing thing that was in the book, but actually really stood out to me, just circling back to gratitude for a second, was when you said that gratitude isn't just looking at what other people don't have and being grateful that you do have. So it's not like saying, oh, I'm grateful I can't get a new car, but at least I have a car, which is better than a lot of the people that don't have a car.
Right.
That wasn't releasing and doing the same thing as looking at your own life separate from any comparisons to other people, but just looking at your own life and saying, what am I grateful for in my life? And I thought that was a really interesting component, that comparing to other people in a way, it didn't produce the same result in the brain as,
Right.
or maybe it even produced sometimes a negative result. It may
Right.
have
It depends.
negated.
Right.
Mhm.
It really depends about like how and why you're doing these things, because
Right.
like all of these different skills, they're kind of like tools. And so they're not like good or bad in and of themselves.
Right.
Like a hammer is a tool, but like how and why you use it will determine like, well, is it helping you or is it
Right.
getting in the
Or
way?
hindering. Mhm.
So if I am hitting a hammer into the drywall, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, it's bad if my toddler's doing that. Like, oh, maybe it's
Right.
good if I'm like demoing, the bathroom so that I can remodel it or whatever. Like, and so the same thing is true of like a lot of these tools like gratitude. And if you're focusing on what other people have or don't have, so that you can then criticize yourself for not feeling more grateful, it's not helpful.
Not helping.
Like, here I am, like, I have so many good things in my life and I don't feel grateful at all. And there's people who are starving and they don't have cars. And like, I don't feel grateful for any of those things. I'm such a terrible person. Like, that's not helpful to compare yourself to other people.
Right.
If instead you're like, oh, wow, like there's so many people who don't have what I have, and it helps you focus on those things more, then sure. The point is that it is recognizing the things that you have and appreciating them is the key part. And sure, if looking at what other people don't have helps you appreciate what you do have, sure, great. But the point is that it's just, that's the way, and that you're realizing what you do have and how much you appreciate it, because our brains evolved, going back to evolution, like the things that are dangerous to us, or the things that we should be really motivated to pursue, are the things that like are unexpected or change. If there's something that's there every day, like even if there's, a lion, but it's there every day and it's just prowling and it never attacks, like, okay, at some point you stop jumping every time that lion, oh, that's just the lion, but he doesn't hurt us or whatever. Like, or if you walk past a fruit tree every day and it's full of fruit, and every day it's full of fruit, well, like, okay, if you're hungry, then you'll take an apple or whatever. But it's not going to like grab your attention as much as if like, oh, most of the time there's no fruit. Oh, but sometimes there is. Oh, I better get as much fruit as I can. So basically, the things that are always consistent, our brain doesn't have to draw our attention towards, because they're always there.
Right.
And that means that when your life is generally really good and you have lots of good things in your life, but that they're always there, or at least almost always there, like, oh, I live in a nice house and I live in a nice neighborhood and I have a nice marriage and I have running water and lots of food to eat. Well, yeah, those things are always there. So like my brain won't automatically guide my attention to them. Instead, it'll just guide my attention to the things that change or potential threats, like my water heater just started dripping and now I have to call a plumber and get it fixed and it's going to take so much money. Like, this actually just happened to me like a few weeks ago.
This sounds a little bit personal right there.
And I was like, this was very distinct from like a year ago when we had a leak inside the house and it was dripping everywhere. This was just like the water heater outside the house was dripping. And so I immediately went to gratitude. I mean, it took me a while. You got to go through your own emotional journey. But then I was like, oh, well, I'm glad that it's outside the house. Like, compared to that leak we had last time, it's not damaging anything. And oh yeah, I'm glad we have hot water. Like, there is the hot water heater doing its job day in and day out for years. And we never even think about it. And like, oh, I'm so glad that I have a hot water heater, because we just take it for granted. And the only time I think about it is, oh, maybe it needs a little maintenance or a screw tightened every once in a while. And so it just gave me an opportunity to appreciate.
I love that. I'm picturing your hot water heater as a person, where you're like, where it's been doing it day in, day out, and nobody ever says thank you for the hot water until it breaks. And then all you do is complain that you're broken. Like, really? Yeah. Now you're going to break?
That's a good meta tip about gratitude, which is essentially, the more that we think of the objects and things in our lives like people, the easier it is to sort of feel appreciation for them. And the more, on the flip side, that we think of the people in our lives like objects, like, well, yeah, of course my wife makes me dinner every day. That's her job. Or like, of course the mailman delivers the mail. That's what he's supposed to do. Like, we're just thinking about like their roles and how they serve us. Like, well, then it's harder to feel grateful, because it's like, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. But to go back to like one of your earlier question about like, why don't we automatically do this, is like, well, some of it is just how the brain evolved. Like, it evolved to get us to pay attention to things that are potentially changing and that are relevant. And it didn't evolve to care about like your happiness. Like, you care about your happiness, but your brain didn't evolve to optimize your happiness. It evolved to optimize your survival and reproduction. And it certainly evolved the capacity to be happy, but it might take some effort. And another reason why it's not automatic is because in order to experience gratitude, it requires some amount of vulnerability to acknowledge like, oh, there's this thing that I need that might not be there, or that I could lose. And if you're trying to say, oh, I don't need hot water, then it's really hard to like experience gratitude for having a hot water heater, because you're like, oh, well, if it broke and I didn't have hot water, I'd be sad. Or like, sometimes like to appreciate the people in your life is to acknowledge like, oh, these people could leave me, or they could die. And that creates feelings of vulnerability, which are uncomfortable, which like our brain is like, oh, I know the quickest way to avoid that feeling of discomfort. Let's just not think about any of these things that, like even if they're temporary, I can still appreciate it. Or even if it's not quite as much as I want, like if I just have a little sip of water, I could appreciate the small sip of water they do have, because it acknowledges like, oh, well, that I could have nothing, and that would be appreciated, as opposed to focusing on all of the water that I don't have, or that it's not enough. And these are at odds a lot of times with the goal-oriented parts of ourselves, because gratitude also teaches us to like be okay with what we have. Like, oh, well, I'm glad I have this little sip of water. Whereas like our goal-oriented nature is like, no, you need to go, you need to find more water and do those things. And that, those sort of goal-oriented parts of ourselves are particularly useful in a capitalist society. We're like, well, you better have goals and you better work and you have a job and you make it because you need that to survive. But like, you know, in the way that our brains evolved, we weren't so like goal oriented about these long-term abstract goals. We were just sort of more present, and it was easier to just be like, oh, I'm glad I have this antelope to eat. And now we're just like, no, but I can't focus on the good stuff that I have now, because then I'll stop being as goal oriented, and then I won't make as much money, and I need to make money to pay for my house or whatever. Like, and the real key is finding the balance between those, where like gratitude doesn't have to prevent you from achieving goals. It sometimes might prevent you from like just trying to achieve goals for the sake of achieving goals because you're scared of not achieving goals.
Right.
Like, oh, you might be satisfied with where you're at. Is that the worst thing? But also gratitude, because it has the power to influence our motivation and reduce our stress, it might actually give us greater capacity to work on our goals. And also, the things that we are grateful for are the things that are important to us. So how do you know which goals you should be focusing on? Well, the problem that most people have is that they're just focused on like, well, this is what my boss yelled at me to do, and like whatever, like, and that creates a lot of stress, as opposed to putting it in the context of like, well, what are all the things in my life that are really important to me? Oh, well, I should focus on doing those goals first. And, if I have to do this thing that my boss asked me to do, well, it's not so stressful if I've actually focused on like, oh, what are all these important things? Like, okay, well, my boss is annoyed, like it doesn't matter that much. Whereas if you're just like, oh my God, I might lose my job, and you focus on all these things you can't control and the negative consequences, that might create more problems.
Yeah. One of the things you said, and I felt this throughout your book, is you were talking about gratitude and having balance. And one of the quotes that you have was, you don't have to change your life in all areas to see a benefit, that each small change in one area will benefit the others. And so I loved this concept that part of our responsibility and opportunity, I guess, as I was reading the book and listening and thinking about myself, is taking the time to evaluate what I'm hearing and thinking about, okay, which of these things do I need right now? And which of these things is going to help me right now? And then not feeling like I have to change everything at once or implement everything at once, or implement, like you said, something super big right away to make a change, but that it was okay to look at where I was right now and to pick out like one or two things that stuck out to me and say, I'm going to start there. And then I really, really appreciated the knowledge now, because of having read the book, that doing that one thing isn't just helping in that one area, but that there's like 3 or 4 areas that one thing is helping with. And so it's almost like I'm brain multitasking without having to do all of those things at the same time.
You by just focusing on doing
the one,
any real world thing that you do is going to have multiple effects on your brain, because like just when we were talking about with the habits, like, yeah, it's changing your choice, but also it's changing your actions, and also it's changing, your environment. So you're not sitting on the couch anymore, you're on the ground or whatever, like, and that causes other effects. And by doing some more, doing the first push-up makes it more likely that I'll do more. And by getting some exercise, that'll improve the quality of my sleep. And when I improve sleep quality, then I'm just better rested. It makes it easier to exercise. It makes it easier to feel positive emotions and focus on what I'm grateful for. Like, so you don't need to like I think sometimes people look at all these different tools and like, oh my God, I have to do all these
I have
different
to do
things.
everything. Yeah.
It's like, no, you just need to start one place, and then you like, it's really just two things that you need to be clear about, like what's important to you and what your limitations are.
Mm.
And like, I was just talking to one of my clients today actually about, she was like, well, sometimes like you have all these different tasks and you're like, should I start on like the big important task first, or should I just do some like, you know, the quick, easy thing to get like a quick win? And there's not one correct answer for everybody because different brains are different. But the question is, okay, can you do the important task? If so, do it.
Do it.
Oh, but I can't do that. Okay, well then don't do it. Do the other thing. Like, but the other thing is more important. Okay, well, it doesn't matter that it's important if you can't do it. And like, maybe you can do it once you get some motivation and start doing, but like, we have multiple things that are important to us and limitations in many different areas because we can't do all of those things at the same time. And you just have to be honest with yourself about like what your limitations are and what is important to you. And it's difficult because it's really easy to lie to yourself, like based on your habits,
sir.
right? Like your habits are really convincing. Your habits tell you, oh, you can't do that. Or like, oh, but this is so easy, you should just do this. And like at some point, the other part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, has to intervene and be like, he's right. The dorsal striatum is right. Like it would be easier to do that. But I've done that like 100 times. And that has led me to here where I am now, which I am dissatisfied with. So let me try doing it a different way. And when it's different, then the stress response is going to activate. Oh, this is stressful. And the dorsal striatum's like, no, really, we got to go back to our old habits. And it comes down to like, again, oh, I can't control that I will be stressed by trying to create a new habit. That's just how the habit system works. My brain always would prefer for me to do old bad habits than potentially try something new, because new is potentially dangerous and stressful. So I could just get dragged along into my old habits. But there's this pesky thing that's like really important to me, like having a good marriage or like having a fulfilling job. And like, if I knew how to get there by just following my old habits, great, do it. Like, there's no one telling you you have to change your quote unquote bad habits. But if at some point you realize, like, oh, that's a limitation, like my habits, the habits that I've trained my whole life, they're pulling me away from the direction that's important to me. Okay, well, then the choice is yours. You can either choose to do the thing that is easier or the thing that's more important. And you can whine like, but I want the more important thing to be the easier thing. Like, okay, well, sometimes we're lucky when that happens and you can acknowledge, oh, I'm so glad that it's so easy. Like, just like with marriage, like, oh, sometimes it's really easy to get along and sometimes not so easy. But like,
not so.
But it helps to actually get through the stresses when you appreciate the times when it's not so easy. And to me, it really comes down to just this matter of choice. Because when you're clear on that landscape of like what's important to you and what your limitations are, it doesn't suddenly mean that you can have everything that you want. It just means like, oh, well, in any situation, whatever is most important to you, you can have that, or at least fight for that. And like that, I think, is sort of the root of all happiness and well-being.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Streakers, we've been talking to Dr. Alex Korb, and it's been absolutely mind-bending and wonderful, and we've appreciated everything he said. You know, something as we just wrap up here, as we come to the conclusion, we'd love to continue talking with you, One of the things that we look at and streaking across the board lives in the prefrontal cortex, because it's the place where you make a choice to do at least one thing and to do that thing every single day until it has an impact on such a way that it connects other things within your brain in order for you to be that person you want to be. Dr. Korb, you talked a lot about the importance, and we talk about who you want to be and what you want to aim for. And if your habits, the way that they are right now, are not serving you well, then look at it and say, is there a 1 or 2 streaks that I can set right now? Like, for example, do at least 1 push-up every day, to the point where it helps me to become who I want to be. This has been absolutely thrilling. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's been wonderful. How can people get a hold of you if they want to either sign up for the Upward Spiral course or be able to get coaching from you or any of those things?
So they go to my website, alexkorbphd.com, or as long as they can remember Alex Korb PhD, like if you put that in Google or in Amazon, like you can find my books or my website, and on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, it's also at Alex Korb PhD. So that's the simplest way. I have a mailing list with a lot of on my website, I have a lot of free resources. Like I have a free guide on the 6 positive neuroscience steps to conquer overthinking.
Great.
A lot of free resources. And, if people need more help and guidance, then I have coaching and programs to get people a little bit more support.
That is awesome. So Streakers, you heard it here. If you want to get a hold of Dr. Alex Korb, he gave you every single way that he could possibly do it, and it would be absolutely fantastic. The Upward Spiral, if you haven't read it yet, you've got to read it. It's an absolutely great read and something that will help you turn downward spirals into upward spirals and get past some of the stress and anxiety that you may feel that's stopping you and move toward more intentional choices. So we just got off talking with Dr. Alex Korb, and it was a dynamic conversation.
Yeah.
And one in which, and you and I were just talking about this, how and what I was saying to you is that I figured out where streaking lives.
Yes.
And it lives in the prefrontal cortex. That is because it's the place. Streaking is intentional, and it's the thing that you intentionally do. You use your brain in order to change whatever it was that you're doing. And you were saying something. So Dr. Korb through this whole thing talks about habits.
Yeah.
And what habits are. But you noticed something about the way that he referenced them.
A lot of times when he would talk about the habits, it was negative. Like the habit is pulling you in this direction. And I felt like even as I was reading the book that habits in his mind was kind of divided into 2 places too. It's the things that you do without thinking, like that and I wish I knew all the terminology like he did, but the part of the brain that wants to go,
I think is what he said.
Yeah. And that part of the brain, its whole function is to just keep doing what it's been doing. Like, I don't want to do anything new. I'm just going to do the same thing. That's my fallback. And the prefrontal cortex is the part that's like, no, I'm going to think about this and be intentional.
I'm going to do it differently.
I'm going to do it differently. But then also talked about forming habits in the sense of those things that you do repeatedly, that nothing is going to change without repeated times of doing it. In fact, one of his quotes that I didn't get a chance to bring up in the book or in the interview with him was, he says in the book, he says, practice, practice, practice. To create new and good habits, you have to repeat them over and over again until your brain rewires itself. At the end of the day, repeated actions is the only way to get them encoded into the dorsal stratum.
And that's where habits live.
Yep.
And that's the interesting thing. And so as we talk to him and as you and I talk about it, the reason why you have streaks and streaking is because you are putting something that works into the prefrontal cortex that is laughably simple, that gives you the mechanism by which you can program the dorsal striatum.
Yep.
Whereas if you don't have that mechanism, the idea of repeating something over and over and over and over again becomes so mundane that your bad habits keep pulling on you toward who you maybe don't want to be, or toward that lazy. And
arena. he talks about, there were so many things. So when he was talking about exercise, and this was more in the book, he says that one of the things that if you want to have exercise, because exercise is one of the things that he talked about that can really help physiology in your brain.
Yeah.
And again, I think we all know that. But he says, add exercise to your to-do list. And then I put in my own words, or make a streak, like so many of us have.
That's what it is. Yep.
Check it off when you complete it. Planning activates the prefrontal cortex, which is exactly what you said. That's where the streak lives. And checking it off the list releases the dopamine. And so that is the whole streaking methodology. And then having that community to celebrate and
to reinforce it.
It gives you all three of those components that help to create the environment that you need to be successful.
As we talked with him, and he was emphasizing the brain science that went behind what it is that he did, I was continually impressed with, like what you said, where the principles are there and the same.
Yep.
The principles exist. And what we do with streaking is give you a tool by which you can enable those principles in your own life to become who you want to be.
Yep. That's
why law number one is so critical for the prefrontal cortex, because the prefrontal cortex in the brain, and this is one of the things he said, it's lazy.
Yeah, the brain is lazy.
And I loved it when I got the chance to ask him about why is it that we don't want to do things? Why is our natural inclination not get up, let's run, let's go, let's exercise? Our natural inclination is grab the bag of chips, sit on the couch, and not do anything. And what he said was, because of our brains were developed in such a way that they are about survival and reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
And survival means you're not just going to waste calories needlessly.
Right. You're going to use them when you need them.
Right.
And not use them and waste them when you don't need them.
Therefore, I'm going to sit here until I actually need to run from some predator or need to chase some piece of food.
Yes.
And otherwise, I'm going to preserve, because if I don't, I'm going to perish. If I do, then I will be able to stick around for a long time. And survival is a critical part of this. So what we're doing is, with streaking, is taking the higher consciousness and really putting in place who we want to be in such a way that we can do it, that we can overcome all of those natural tendencies, because it's so laughably simple to write at least one sentence that I can overcome the idea that this is going to cause a lot of energy and effort. And I just
and what does it matter anyway?
Right. And what does it matter anyway? And all those things.
If you haven't, I would recommend reading the book.
Yeah.
It's great. The book focuses on overcoming depression, but it really, in my mind, as I was reading it, I look at it and I thought, actually, it's even more just good mental health all the way around.
Yeah.
How to do the things that will keep you healthy and being able to be the person you want to be throughout all the different situations that come at us through life. Yeah. And so anyway, if you haven't read the book, read the book and read it from the mind of streaking as you look at it and think, okay, because that was me. I came away and I thought, okay, I've got some new streaks. And even maybe some ways that I look at and was going to tweak a few of the streaks that I already had, or even just looking at it and saying, now I even understand more what this streak is doing.
You know what?
And how the chemicals it's releasing in my brain and the other areas in my life that doing this one little thing is also impacting and improving.
As you listen to the podcast, you'll have heard where, I think, Jami, you were mentioning about how one small thing.
I have to say, it was so hard to not just want to. I had so many notes, and I want to comment. I want to comment.
That's why we're talking now. To you afterward, is because there were so many things
I wanted to
interrupt
say
and talk to him about. But you were mentioning about how one thing done a lot can have an impact on a whole bunch of things.
Yes, that you don't have to change everything.
All
that
at once.
One thing.
And this is one of the things we talk about in streaking, where if you choose one streak and do it for 100 days, you're going to notice impact in many areas of your life, not just one.
And I don't know if this ties in, but I thought so much about what you've been posting lately about 3 streaks,
with 3 streaks, 1 run.
1 run. And it's that same concept, because I thought, what things are you accomplishing when you go out and do that? I thought, 1, it's the streak of get outside, which getting outside has to do with the way that you're breathing, which is something that he talks about in the book that can help. Sunshine, he talks about out in the book that can help. And then actually physically moving, which is another one of the things. So that's just getting outside. And then you're picking up a piece of trash, which is noticing your environment around you, making a small difference. Also gratitude. Also, oftentimes when you post your trash, you're smiling, which is another thing because
it
makes
is so much fun. I have a really good time
I know.
with that.
But I was just looking at and thinking, I'm like, you've combined three streaks into one run, is the way you say it. But even within those 3 streaks, I could think of 10 different areas that would benefit that he talks about that are releasing chemicals in your brain from those things that you're doing. 10 things that are happening in a positive way that are creating that upward spiral, which I thought was amazing. You don't have to do, maybe we don't have to do as much as we think.
Right.
Maybe the smaller things, we do them and then recognize that they're doing more than we think.
It's like it's sometimes when I think about when we wrote the book, we stumbled onto some of these things, and now it's nice to have the
validation, the scientific validation that it's true.
Yeah. So if you have an opportunity, we'd love to hear your comments. Rate the podcast, rate also, if you wouldn't mind, or subscribe to it. That would be fantastic as well. Download the app and you'll be able to see a lot of these things in action that he talks about. And if you download the app, also, if you wouldn't mind giving a rating, we'd appreciate that. You can always reach out to Jami or I, Jeffrey, Jeffery, at thestreakingapp.com, or
Jami, Jami, at thestreakingapp.com.
Until we talk again.
Keep streaking.
It's the little things that make a better